Greeting viewers, thank you for joining us. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi warmly welcomes both our local and global audience to the continuation of our African Book Talk series. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi is part of 9 regional hubs positioned strategically around the world by Columbia University. The centers serve as platforms for dialogue and the exchange of knowledge in research, education, and public programming. Today, we are stretching our boundaries to cover a thought-provoking and somewhat touchy subject of conservation efforts in Africa. We are talking about the big conservation lie with authors Dr. John Mbaria and Dr. Mordecai Ogada. We hope to stimulate your mind through this conversation. John Mbaria is a trained spatial planner and an award-winning Kenyan journalist who has investigated and written on wildlife conservation since August 2000. Dr. Mbaria started as a physical planner before detouring to journalism. He has written for several national newspapers in Kenya, such as the Daily Nation and the East African. He was an occasional contributor for the Greenpeace magazine of Germany and a visiting writer with Investigate West, which is US-based online investigative journal. Dr. Mordecai Ogada is a carnivore ecologist who has been involved in conservation work for the last 16 years in Kenya and other parts of Africa, mainly in human-wildlife conflict mitigation and carnivore conservation. His biological work includes studies on lions, hyenas, cheetah, African wild dogs, and otters. Dr. Ogada's professional work has included research and teaching conservation leadership at Colorado State University. Much of his energy has been devoted to community-based conservation, wildlife policy, and wetlands ecology. Nyagodhi Chege will be moderating the session today. Nyagodhi has over 20 years of experience in sustainable development, public sector governance, and human resources development in the nonprofit sector, higher education institutions, and international financial institutions. Previously, she served as a lecturer in law and director of human rights and international law at the Office of Social Justice Initiatives at Columbia University School of Law in New York, and as an inaugural director of career services and professional development at Perkins University School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen, China. We will post these bios on the chat for your reference. Kindly note, as we proceed, this program is being recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel in the coming week. As we proceed, please post your questions under the Q&A section. And remember to follow us on social media. We will post our social media handles in the chat area. Follow us, we have many more exciting programs coming up. Nyagodhi, you're now most welcome to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. I hope everybody can hear me. Mordecai and Mbaria, can you hear me? Great, thanks. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. Very good to have so many of you join us today for what I think really promises to be a very vibrant discussion, and of course, extremely timely. And I want to say congratulations to our two authors for being so appropriate in terms of this topic and how timely it is, even when we're discussing this a few years after publication. So congratulations to you both, Mbaria and Mordecai, on penning this very thought-provoking book and what has been called a very brave book, one of the bravest books of the past decade, as Joyce Nairo says in in her blurb on the book. So I'll just get started. As Pauline said, please post your questions in the Q&A section online, and we shall get to those, but we shall begin with hopefully some pointed questions for you, for the panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience and go back and forth that way. So what I would like to do is, I will not actually start with asking our authors what is the big conservation line. I think we'll get to that in a little bit. But what I do want to begin with is a question on what is the crisis that, this very big crisis that the conservation models that have been in place in Kenya for over 100 years. What is this big crisis that our various conservation models have been trying to address? And maybe if I could start with Mbaria, if you're able to answer that question and tell us a little bit about what that crisis is and get us started on that.
As it was foresaid, we are actually practitioners at different levels. Ogada, my co-author, is a practitioner, is a scientist. I myself am a journalist. Before that, I was actually conservation, I was an environmental planner and actually worked with the state. So between the time we wrote this book and the time I detoured from land use planning to journalism, I experienced firsthand what is so wrong about conservation in Africa, and more so in Kenya. One of the things that I came across is the open racism, in the sense that the contribution of Africans, either as societies or as individuals, was overlooked as the conservation edifice in Kenya came into being. So you'll find a people who for probably thousands of years had preserved the resource that other people became famous for and benefited immensely from, were actually totally ignored. I mean, I don't know how this happened. You come to a place, you come to a country, you come to a continent, you find a resource that was so well preserved through that age-old conservation philosophy and ethics, and you totally ignore it. I mean, this is amazing. The other thing that I came across is the neglect of the communities that live with wildlife. At the beginning of the book, I write about my experience at the Shaba National Reserve, where I saw this elderly Samburu woman who dipped her jerry can into this dirty crocodile-infested water. Then I looked at the way the whole conservation was organized. This neglects her interest. She is the origin, she and her people are the original landowners, but they are neglected. In any case, what has happened is that we have apartheid in conservation, where animals are put apart, people are put up. And this happens after displacing so many thousands of people to create that pristine spectacle that pleases the eye of white people in America and Europe. I mean, how is that? The other thing that we also came across is the fact that there was open corruption. But you see, corruption is associated with Black people. It's not associated with white people. But you saw this. I saw people who would get killing quotas in a country that disallowed hunting or even what is called consumptive utilization of animals in 1977 through a presidential decree. So, but you find that people were getting quotas to kill animals. And given by who? One of the most famous so-called conservation in this world, Dr. Richard Leakey, late Dr. Richard Leakey. So you see all these things. You come across these things on a day-to-day basis as a journalist. And I found that because this conservation philosophy and practice was so removed from the lives and the livelihoods of people, and the setup that is Kenya and Africa, so you find massive losses of species and population of wildlife. So you, on one hand, you are getting people, there are people who are getting accolades, global accolades for conserving. But on the other hand, the species are disappearing. Population of wildlife is getting lost. So what is the contradiction? Simply because this was a conservation philosophy model that had nothing to do with the reality in Kenya and Africa. And still it's not real. It's something that is planted. So this is partly, I think I'm going to talk about much later. Partly this is what I saw. Thank you.
Excellent. Great, thanks, Mbaria. I think you raised several points there, and I'd like to just follow on a couple of them. I mean, you talked about what is the reality of a stark racial difference in terms of, and you both pointed out in your book who we think of as conservationists. You mentioned one, the late Dr. Richard Leakey, versus and there's a series. There's a lot of conservationists who are mentioned and have these global accolades, and they're all white. And what I see from your book, I note from page 8, you said conservation is now almost exclusively associated with whiteness. And later down that same page, you say, in most instances, Black Africans are portrayed as people who need to be sensitized so that they can either accept or learn to love animals that live in their midst or the wilderness that they inhabit. And yet, what you point out, what you've said here, Mbaria, and also in the book, you've pointed out how, you know, pre-colonial times, there was a tradition and history and cultural practices of conservation and protection of animals and biodiversity in our country. And so I wanted to go into that a little bit, Mordecai. Maybe if you could talk about that a little bit. You said in the book, you know, for the African, preserving nature was not something done to capture the attention of others. It was a day-to-day practice enshrined in the cultural and economic system and organically developed through the ages. Mordecai, could you talk a little bit more about this? What are some of these traditional practices that we saw that were pretty standard across Kenya, and that the communities engaged in to protect and conserve their environment?
Okay, thank you, Nairobi, for the question. I think we have to get sort of to the philosophy of it, and the first philosophical point we all have to note: there is no indigenous African language that I know of that has a word for conservation. Conservation is a concept developed by destructive societies. So for us, conservation was just the way we lived. We didn't have to talk about it. If you don't talk about keeping the river clean because you're fetching water from there. You don't talk about destroying the forest that gives you medicinal plants, or cutting down the trees that house your beehives, and destroying the grasslands that your animals graze. So conservation was a philosophy that was in the way people live because we needed it. We could not, if we destroyed the forest, the society would die. If the Ogiek people destroyed the forest, their society would die. It's simple as that. If the Luo people in Nyanza destroyed the lake environment, they would not have fisheries. It's simple as that. If the Maasai destroyed the grasslands, their livestock, their livelihood and identity would die. So we had to do all this. Contrived, what I call contrived conservation is what was introduced to us by settlers from destructive societies that had basically decimated what they had there, and then they needed to sort of establish. It was a power thing. It's more a power trip that started with Roosevelt in 1910. So I think my position on this would be that we only have to look out there and recognize it. And a lot of people will have asked me before, and I'm sure you'll have heard it, that where can we get examples of this? And they ask you to point them towards peer-reviewed journals. As a scientist, I can say without fear of contradiction that if conservation science is prejudiced, the ground zero of the prejudice is in the peer review process. Anything like what I'm saying now would not pass peer review because the peers have the job of protecting the kingdom that is conservation now. So we really have to there's so much we have to unlearn before we can see these things as they truly are. And I think if someone wants to learn about conservation, go out to somewhere like Samburu, not to a park. Don't go to a park. Parks are artificial. Parks are whiteness, are white spaces, even though they're run by black rangers. Parks are white spaces. So go out somewhere like just in Baringo or in the rangelands where there's wildlife and there's people, and see how they behave around the wildlife and how the wildlife behaves around them. I think then you'll read. Reading is not only what's written in literature. We need to read environment, read people, and read the interactions between these different forces. I think that's where conservation lies. What we do now that is heavily funded by donors and is patronized by tourists looking for romantic trips is not conservation.
So if you could expand a little bit more on that, Mordecai, when you're talking about the cultural practices that were inherent in the traditions, in the practices of different Kenyan communities, you mentioned a few of those in the book, right? You also talk about the integration of animals into our folklore, for example, or even in the naming system. You say, we had people who in English would translate the name to leopard or something like that, right? If we were to look at those, if we were to go to not a protected area, what is it that we're seeing? What are we seeing either in in the Kaya forests along the coast, or what are we seeing amongst the Samburu people?
I think okay, what we see in the traditional structures. There are a number of different things, like in the forests in Meru and various other places. There's sacred forests that are used for initiation procedures or by the elders for prayer. Mount Kenya forest is used by several traditional religious groups for prayer and all that. These functions, non-consumptive functions of these resources, acted as buffers against destruction or misuse. And the fact that people go there for initiation would mean that no one can just march in there and chop down trees. There are many of these forests, even in Meru, where even when people used to hunt, if an animal, you'd try and catch the animal before it ran into that forest, because if it went in there, you don't go in after it, you let it go. And these sort of relationships with the environment, and that's something that comes from people who live in lands that they're indigenous to. If someone is referred to, like for myself, Komala, where I come from, is a certain hill in Nyanza, and people are referred to as such. So when our identity is tied so closely to where we come from, that destruction of that place where we come from is anathema. It's like destruction of our identity. So our wildlife and resources and natural resources are like part of us. Like when we call a child in Luo, a child is named Liech as an elephant, or Sibuor as a lion, or Kwach as a leopard. This is homage to that animal. So we don't get excited or fall in love with that animal. We revere the animals. Falling in love, that's something from Disney. That's ridiculous. Although I've had several Kenyan conservationists talk about falling in love with wildlife. That's rubbish. We need to revere them and tap into the reverence that people had for these animals in ages gone by. So even now we have discussions around Zimbabwe. You see European countries discussing whether or not Zimbabwe should be allowed to sell off its ivory stockpiles. Yet European countries are the ones who buy this ivory. It's ridiculous. So we have to get back conservation back rooted in what was here before the saviors, quote unquote saviors, came, because that's what's sustainable socially and financially. We have to spend so much money. We have to be so violent. We have to be so cruel, because what we are doing is abnormal. It's not. It doesn't fit into our society.
So it's very interesting thinking about the difference between loving an animal versus revering it, right? And how we then in traditionally would have treated the animals differently because we had a different relationship with them. It wasn't putting them on a pedestal that weren't a part of, animals are very much a part of the everyday life of Kenyans, I think you're saying. Mbaria, if you could take us now to life after. The systems and the models that were set up, and let's say, beginning about 100 years ago, at the beginning of colonialism, what changed? What's different? What was the philosophy that was driving either the conservation or the treatment, the reaction to animals of the colonialists? Because I don't think it was always driven by conservation. It wasn't always driven by protection. What was the philosophy behind it, and therefore what systems were set up, through colonialism in the early days of that time?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with me that initially it was not about conservation. It was about hunting. It was about people who were many years down the line after industrial revolution, they started romanticizing nature. That is, during the Renaissance and after that, a lot of the people started romanticizing nature. But at the same time, there were people who came in, and when you look at the history of the national parks, including national park like Amboseli, it was a very huge reserve that was set aside, particularly for hunters. And most of these people are actually royal people who are from the upper classes in Britain. So a lot of this was not about protection of animals, all the way to the time that Roosevelt came over, and the number and the amount of resources that he spirited away from Kenya. So what informed this was to preserve these areas initially, specifically for hunting. But I think much later, they felt, and these people can check this out, they felt that they needed to prevent the African people. Okay, there were different communities. There were communities that hunted. They didn't hunt for sport. They hunted for food. And people took as much as they required for that particular time. So they wanted to prevent this. They also came in, and I think it also came in with the fact that there were resources within those national parks. And this is the hidden secret. Because around 1940s, late 1940s, Russian geologist, and we heard this from none other than the Russian ambassador here in 2003. He was quoted on national television saying that Russian geologists actually knew what Kenya had in the 1940s, shortly after the war, Second World War. So immediately after that, we start seeing national parks, starting with the Nairobi National Park being gazetted. I think it was gazetted in 1946, I think 1 year after the Second World War. So our suspicion, and this is what we put in the book, is that the British knew exactly what we had. And I think they went out with, they spirited away all those documents about our geology, the exploration and all that. And this is the missing link when conservation, and people talk about conservation, the link between the resources underground and the so-called conservation project, national conservation project. So what am I saying? I'm saying it was not informed at all by conservation. And I think conservation was like an afterthought. Why? Because yes, the world had destroyed so much and people realized that they could gain so much, not necessarily by organizing tourism or a tourist to visit those places, but by the so-called not-for-profit, starting not-for-profit organizations. So initially, yes, it was about preserving these places for hunting. Secondly, they realized that there were resources underground which they needed to preserve and to keep. And that's why and I invite people to do this, if you look at all the national parks in this country, and you juxtapose those maps with the map of mineral occurrences in Kenya, you find that you can actually fit in, they can actually overlay them, meaning that the maps where conservation is done, either at the level of national park or national reserve, or places outside national parks, or even places that are now being preserved by bodies like the Northern Rangeland Trust. And the minerals occurrence map, you are going to find that they actually coincide. So this is the hidden agenda which we expose in the book. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. If I pull up a little comment that you have here is, you say in the book, because conservation in Africa has built around itself the well-worn aura of altruism and absence of any material gain therefrom, which I think it ties in really. I think it summarizes, I think, what you're suggesting here. But I want to tease out a little bit. So you're using some terms here that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of how we understand them. We talk about the national parks, but then we also talk about the non-profit organizations, the NGOs, that are also involved, and also NRT. And it would be helpful, I think, to sort of lay groundwork to explain what these different institutions and organizations are and how they're related to each other, especially the history, the chronological history of how they came about. So maybe Mordecai, if you could start us out with, first of all, what's a park and how do we think about a national park, right? And sometimes we use the word park or reserve, and you're welcome to explain that a little bit more, but I'm especially interested in when you have the national parks and there's national law, national institutions that are involved in the management of those parks, then you have these conservancies as well, how those related. And then especially when you have now organizations like NRT, what's the relation amongst those three types of institutions?
Thank you. Yeah, that is important, especially since some of our audience are not from Kenya. Now, national parks were established by the National Parks Ordinance. They're state-run. They're gazetted. They're gazetted and run by Kenya Wildlife Service, which is the statutory authority. And those are even in our devolved system of government, those are under the national government, state authority. Then we have reserves. Reserves are like Masai Mara, Samburu Reserve, Bogoria, Buffalo Springs. These are also state run, but by they used to be run by the county councils, but now they're run by county governments. So now these are state run but run by the devolved units of government. Conservancy. Conservancy is a mongrel because it does not have any proper definition. A conservancy is a very useful tool for annexing land, escaping taxes, the pseudo-altruism we see, etc., because we struggle to find any definition in law that exists. So some conservancies are land that you are told stories about, it's been set aside by this community for conservation, etc. Some used to be privately owned ranches. Someone decides from today, this ranch, which was a cattle ranch, is now a conservancy, and they have the necessary tax breaks. So this a non-profitable ranch turns into a very profitable non-profit called a conservancy, if you can follow that train. So the conservancy is a very problematic concept in Kenya today, and it is the most useful tool for annexation of land. Certainly in Kenya, I don't know much about other parts of Africa, because things like the Magadi area, where there's a 250,000 acre piece of land leased around Lake Magadi by Magadi Soda Company. The lease is coming to an end, and instead of it automatically returning to the community, they're already talking of turning it into a conservancy. That shows you how useful the conservancy concept is to anyone who wants to acquire land in ways other than buying it. So the conservancy is very much where the problem lies, and that's where we are having we are encountering very slippery ethical grounds, because these conservancies attract huge amounts of donor funding. A couple of years ago, the Minister for Wildlife, Honorable Balala, said that about $25 million of donor funding comes in to conservation in Kenya every year. Out of that, only 2 million goes to Kenya Wildlife Service. This shows that we've created a false economy where, quote unquote, philanthropy is actually earning more than the enterprise from safari, the actual enterprise or business of safari tourism. And this resides within conservancy, largely within the conservancy arena. The conservancy arena is also what covers a lot of the mineral areas that Mbaria is referring to. The oil discoveries in Turkana were suddenly or strangely under conservancies, as is the natural gas exploration areas around Lamu in the northern Kenya coast. And this is the problem with the conservancy model, and because it is not defined and it can shapeshift as and when its owners require it. And I think a lot of the problems we talk about in conservation arise from the fact that there's this body that's outside the state that has armed law enforcement outside the state organs, is gaining more and more power, and foreign donors are giving more money to that amorphous model than they're giving to the state model that we know and that has reporting structures.
Mm. Yes, Leonard Omulo in the Q&A said, you had talked about corruption earlier, and he's talking about this here too. He says the corruption in conservation highlighted by Mbaria also extends to global funding and the management of most conservation agencies coming to work in Africa. But let's tease that out a little bit. Conservancies, we hear about community-based conservancy models, right? And don't the communities lease their land out to corporations? So don't they own the land? Would the land revert back to them? Why should we be concerned if we're setting up these lodges for tourists to come through? That isn't necessarily inherently granting ownership or right of excavation or or sale of the minerals that happen to be on that land, or is this a different situation?
The source of concern with community conservancies is basically the elimination of the native, if I can call it that, quoting from Patrick Wolf on settler colonialism. I think the purported organization of a community to have a chairman, secretary, a committee chairman, secretary, treasurer, and those kind of things, and creates a structure through which an entire 50,000, 40,000 acres of land with 20,000 residents or whatever can be narrowed down to a small group of 6 or 7 people who now have the right to sign away that birthright of the entire community for 25 years. Most of the leases are 25 years, etc. And that when you narrow it down to that level, they can be corrupted, as they do get corrupted. They can be coerced in different ways to sign on to these agreements. And typically what happens is that they sign for this agreement, and some do-gooder says, I'm coming to build for you a lodge so you can make money out of tourism. So they come and build a lodge. Typically it's a very nice lodge, and they hugely overprice it. They say we've invested $10 million in this lodge. So we've built the nice lodge. So we are running it until it pays that back. And we are paying you lease fees as a bed night fee or as a portion of the profits. And then you get a very good accountant that declares losses. So you end up with this land, 50,000 acres or whatever amount of land, with elephants and lions and everything in it, and a beautiful lodge, basically rent-free. When someone opens a bar in a building in Nairobi, he doesn't pay rent as a share of the profits. He pays 10,000 a month, even if he sells no beer that month. That's how it works. And then the thing is, these agreements are problematic because, first of all, they're completely confidential, and you can't find them anywhere. In Kenya, the most basic agreement, a marriage certificate between 2 people, you can go and find a copy in the Sharia house of anybody's marriage certificate to prove if he or she is married or not. These conservation agreements are hidden. Secondly, 25-year agreements under those terms is inherently wrong, because within 25 years, a baby can be born, grow to an adult man or woman, and have a baby of her own or his own without being any party to this agreement that governs the way they live and the resources they use. So there are some fundamentally wrong things there, and you can see that they consulted very clever lawyers to put this together, because this basically piracy comes across as, actually it looks really good. It looks like philanthropy, and donors fall for it all the time, and they give it millions of dollars. And that's the problem with that model, basically.
May I chip in?
Please.
Yeah, I think I want to emphasize on how these agreements are made, because this was part of my work as a journalist. I investigated a lot of these agreements, and one of the things that amazed me was the fact that they were not the agreements and how the benefits were apportioned. As Dr. Ogada says, it was not based on any valuation of the land, for instance. We have a community of, like, let's say, of maybe 3,000 or more people, with, or rather devoting maybe 10,000 acres of their land to this agreement. Someone comes in, says, like Ogada says, that I am investing 50 million shillings into this partnership. But what accrues from whatever bed night they are selling, whatever tourism businesses they have organized, you find that this guy is getting like a lion's share. So even it's a fact that some of these agreements are made by lawyers, but on the part of communities, they actually don't benefit at all much, because it's like, I'm in business with you, but you come to my house and you're buying food in my house. So these people say that they are investing in classrooms, in health centers, in all manner of community projects. So if I'm in business with you, why would you come to my house and start buying food? No. So there's a lot that needs to be investigated. And the other thing is that, and it's a pity that KWS, the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is actually be guiding such agreements, is co-opted in the whole thing. They have a community liaison arm, which I don't know what work it does. So they are 40 from the word go. They are not based, they are made based on deceit. They are also based on secrecy, like Ogada says, because I have never seen one agreement, even as a journalist. I've looked and looked, and I've been in this thing for more than 20 years, and I've never seen one agreement. But they are there. You understand there are agreements. So who holds these agreements? Anyway, I just wanted to emphasize that. Thank you.
Right. No, I think you've both pointed out some shortcomings. There's the transparency issue, which is of course is key. Lack of participation of the community, because it looks like it's a very small group that is involved in this, and also the inequity in terms of the sharing of both the resources and the benefits that accrue from exploiting those resources. But I want to ask a question which is kind of related to what Brian Hezekiah has asked in the Q&A, and this is about the law. These are legal, right? We've got the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act. As you're saying, KWS is the agency that is, and it's a national agency that is responsible for the protection and management of wildlife in Kenya. If you could have these agreements which were more transparent, more equitable, in all, we solve all those problems that you've identified. Do you believe that these models are still appropriate for us in Kenya? Or do you think that there's something inherently faulty about it? And I want to tie this to the issue of, the model that's used around the concept of protection, right? And exclusion, because that's what we have with national forests, right? We exclude communities from these areas. But do you think this particular model can be cured, and therefore, would be appropriate if it for our society? Mordecai, maybe I start with you.
First of all, you're right in saying that these things are legal, using that term. And I think, apart from the part that we have these corrupt buccaneers running roughshod over us, I think they are number one to blame. But that's their livelihood. They're making their money. The biggest blame I apportion is to our state systems. Our conservation arena is a policy vacuum. No one does anything that is connected to anything else or that has any logical direction. And I do not fear contradiction over that. We are just like a boat drifting down the water, and these people are taking advantage of that vacuum. Coming to these agreements, I would not go as far as to say that there's no agreement that can be good, but from what I know of the ones I have seen, one thing I would say is that an agreement on natural resource use, for example, in an area that is prone to drought every 5 years, you cannot have an agreement more than 5 years in duration over that. That's one thing. And if they say they can't do it that short, then to hell with it, just to do away with them. The other thing is that the agreements need to be based on existing livelihoods where the people live. They should not have any reference to where these people should live and what they should do as their livelihoods. So the moment an agreement involves moving someone from his or her ancestral home, I mean, that is what we know. The rest of we know as our shags. My mind cannot even fathom someone moving me away from the home where my father is buried. I can't even fathom that. So any agreement that involves movement of people to create clear areas, we should do away with that. So these agreements on natural resource use, etc., can be done, but they should not be based on tourism. They should be based on resource use and present livelihoods. And if tourism is to come in anywhere, and this is right across the board, tourism should only come in as a byproduct of conservation. It should never be the reason for conservation. Those of us who've been privileged to tour even in Asia and other places, there's lots of wonderful things we see, but none of those things are being done for us as tourists. Like in India, the Taj Mahal is probably the most famous thing. It wasn't built for tourists. It was built as a tomb for a queen, I think. And all the beautiful temples were built for worship, not for tourists. So we should stop doing things based on tourism. Tourism should just witness and participate in what we are doing for ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Mordecai. Barry, did you want to add to that?
If I may add, yes, I want to add. If I may add, we should also have agreements that recognize the cultural practices of the people, because a lot of those cultural practices have implications on conservation. So you'll find people who preserve certain areas because they are sacred to them as a community. You also find that there are communities who have well-organized traditional systems of managing the resource, managing the rangeland. And I have in mind the Borana community. They have a system called DETHA. I'm not able to pronounce it like a Borana, but it's called DETHA, which actually has a system of how land and the rangeland is used right from the time that there is enough rain to the time that the rain becomes much less, to during dry periods, all the way to when the rangeland is so dry. And this is like, it's a cyclical way of using the rangeland. So when you come in and you sign agreements that do not recognize that system, and you put in place your own cultural elders, what are you doing? You are replacing an age-old appropriate system that had worked so well, which was based on maybe trial and practice, trial and error, but over the years, people had learned, over the hundreds of years, people had learned how to use the resource in such a way that you are having drought, but at the same time, you are able to survive. So I'm saying that this agreement should be made, but they should be made in accordance with how people know how to use the land as pastoralists, for instance, and over many, many years back, how they have utilized the range.
So let me just follow up, pick up that thread there, Barry, because there you've talked about, you know, these age-old practices and traditions. And for example, particularly in the rangelands where you've got pastoralists. So I want to ask you a question specifically related to that. And I was listening to a conversation amongst these pastoralist communities who were lamenting the fact that the youth in their communities are less interested now in the way of life. And our times are changing. There's a lot of change, you know, in terms of children are going to school, both boys and girls are going to school. They're not necessarily available to move with the community in the manner that you're saying. Our elders are not necessarily passing on the traditions to the younger generation the way it used to be in the past. So you've got that one question with, and I think you asked this in this book, are the traditional methods still sustainable? Are they still relevant? I think was the question, one way you asked it in your book. And I'll tie that to a question that's in the chat with a request to talk about population growth. We've heard this from no less than the Prince William, who says that part of the challenge with us here in our rangelands is population growth, and there's a excessive stress that's put in on our environment, and that is what's causing so much strain, etc. So could you speak about how relevant and how adaptable some of these traditions and practices are today, and how relevant they are into today's models?
I think to respond to that, we cannot say that we are heading somewhere because we do not have a direction to where we are going. What I mean is that, yes, the youth are out there and they want change, they want to belong to the modern world, they're into modernity and all that. But you find that it's simply because the systems that are put in place actually lead people towards that direction, all the way from maybe the time we were colonized. But the question would be, are we heading to the right direction? Yes, the youth are leaving the rural areas and coming to Nairobi and these other major towns, including youth from communities, pastoralist communities. But you also find something else that is happening, which is people are actually now starting asking themselves, probably the voice is muted today, is not so strong, but people are starting to ask themselves, including people questioning even Christianity as a religion. People even questioning the modern way that is based on Western philosophy and thinking about life and all that. And communities are not like a human being, a person. A person will live 70 years of age, maybe more than that, if they are lucky enough. But communities have been here for thousands of years. It doesn't mean that because one system is working today, and it's based on our exploitation of resources, and it's based on people moving towards a place, but they do not even know where they're going. So I think, yes, I have seen an attempt myself, particularly from the community I come from, people questioning all these things. And I've also seen, because I have participated and I have actually covered some of the activist events in the North, that you'll find the youth are actually participating. But you're also finding something else which is happening. We cannot talk about being overpopulated in a country that does not have respect for land use planning. I'm a land use planner myself, but I can tell you that we can actually preserve much more range than we have today. We can have more space for wildlife than you have today, and you have better living conditions of people here. Look like a country like Japan, and I don't want to give examples that are out there. Japan, I think over 67% of the land is reserved as forest. In a population with, I think there are more than 300 million, if I'm not wrong. And Japan is has much less land surface area than Kenya. So what are we saying? We are saying that yes, things are haywire today. There's this assumption that the West has dominated the thoughts and practices, but I don't think that this will hold for a long time. And I'm not looking at this like in the next 10, 20 years, but the fact that people are questioning this today doesn't mean that it will always hold. If they are questioning today, can you ask yourself what will happen in 20 years time, 30 years time, with all these contradictions? So I'm not overly concerned that the youth have run away from this. But I'm saying that this is a temporary thing, and people always whenever systems are destabilized, they come back to equilibrium. Don't you think so? Thank you.
If I may add something, the question about pastoralism and modernity, I can tell that the person who asked that has no idea what pastoralism is about, because pastoralism is it's a production system, it is an identity, and it's a very, very profitable production system with a very light footprint on the environment. That's why it's lasted for, I don't know, 10,000 years. So that's one of the myths that the conservation pirates, if I can call them that, do, that we are trying to modernize these people from pastoralism, because pastoralism is ancient, it's uncivilized, it's much more civilized to be a waiter in a lodge. And next, the question of population, and I'm going to address this from a scientific standpoint. The environmental crisis we face that's global right now is about emissions. Emissions are about consumption patterns, not about absolute numbers of people. The 50 million whatever population of Kenya does not have even emissions that are 1% of the 200 or so million people they have in the United States. It's because the carbon footprint of a family in the United States is equivalent to a few villages in rural Kenya. That's just how it is. So when we talk about human population, these are matters that are important for our human services like schools, hospitals, IEBC, setting up voting stations, etc. But in the conservation sector, this should not even be brought to the table. And I can tell the origin of whoever brought that issue to the table. And that's one thing we must reject in total. When you want to talk population in Kenya, come and talk to Ministry of Health and Social Services and Education, but not on the environmental, not at the environmental level. So yeah. that is very important, because nobody talks about the 1.5 billion people in China being a danger to the giant panda population. No one talks about the 1.3 billion in India being a danger to tigers. It's just the 50 million in Kenya that are a problem to elephants. We will not tolerate that. Thank you.
No, those are some excellent comments. I noticed that Violet Maitiru had her hand up, Pauline, so maybe after this set of questions, Pauline, just confirm if you'll be able to take her question, if you'll be able to unmute her. But I want to come back to we're talking about, Barry, we're talking about the changes that we're seeing now, particularly with younger people and people rethinking and questioning these stories that we've heard about ourselves, right, us as Kenyans. And you mentioned in the book, I think, 2 examples of people who are doing things differently. There was the program, the Lion Guardians program with the Masai Moran, that I think would be interesting for us to hear about, traditional methods that have been adapted to today. And you talked about that being very successful. And also, there's a research institution, I think, that you had mentioned as well, that's training Kenyans for us to be our own, to develop our own capacity, our own professionals who are thinking about this work. Are you able to talk about, maybe starting with you, Barry, if you could talk a little bit about the new changes that we're seeing and the positive models that you're seeing that are addressing the situation today?
Yeah, maybe at a larger level, and also at a micro scale. I know there are people, there are organizations that have involved the youth. I once covered Lion Guardians as a journalist, and I remember them using the traditional tracking methods of the Maasai to kind of track lions and ensure that lions do not get into conflict with communities because they killed livestock. And involving this Maasai, I remember writing a story in the East Africa, and it was very fascinating that these are people, some of them are actually, before that they used to guide poachers, but then they were rehabilitated and they started looking at this resource in a way, in a different manner. And because they were actually benefiting from that, they were able to participate more effectively because they had that traditional knowledge, because which they must have gained as they grew in these places. But I also think I remember, and you did not mention this, but I think I can bring it up. I remember participating in a ritual in Meru, just close to Chuka town. I think it's called the Getune Forest. There was a belief in the local community believed that Murugu or Guy or God would, when God was moving from Mount Kenya to Nyambene Hills, he would actually step on that forest. He's on a hill. And I remember initially the youth did not understand the spiritual significance of it was a small forest. But they were, and they were actually warned by a very effective council of elders there in Cholincheke not to continue destroying the forest, but they didn't hear, so they went on. There were all manner of things that were happening in the forest, but after that, the Cholincheke invited everybody from the community, from the local community, to come in and actually witness a ritual that they did. And after that, because it was very elaborate, I don't want to go into the details of it because I covered it for the East African. But after that, nobody would dare to even step in there without kind of cleansing themselves. Nobody would dare to destroy the forest. I went there 3 years after the ritual, and I remember there was massive undergrowth. So what are we talking about? You're talking about youth who were made to understand the spiritual significance of this forest. So what we are missing in this country, and I think this can go all the way to the education system, is that you cannot replace an entire system that has been that has organically grown for maybe like thousands of years, and supplant it with something that was developed elsewhere, and believe that you can survive in that same environment using systems that are very inappropriate, and believe that you will survive in that environment for hundreds of years. Some people are not stupid. They start looking and saying, why is it that we don't have a lot of rain? Why is it that we were told there was a brook or there was a spring that was used by our ancestors here, and it no longer exists? What happened to it? So this, I want to go back to my statement. I'm not overly concerned. It might not happen in 10, 20 years, but I think we are moving. It might be a step, maybe one step, maybe two steps. As we move one step forward or two steps forward and one step backward, but we still move on. But I think we are getting somewhere. It might not be very apparent for people, maybe people living in difficulties and also in economic hardships and people living maybe in Nairobi or these other big towns, or people in school. But I believe that change doesn't come, change is gradual, it takes time. And probably we were headed towards what people thought is modernity, but I also believe that modernity where we are headed, I don't think we can sustain this. We can't sustain it. And you are not stupid as a people. We'll think about it, and we have started to think about it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for those comments. Okay. Violet?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, your question?
Okay, actually, yeah, so my question was to us as Kenyans, just a question to ask the extent to which us as conservation professionals are coming together to work with our communities to develop our own alternative models. And it's really encouraging to see, like in Nyagodhi, the way you reached out and, you know, to have this discussion. But do you know of initiatives where conservation professionals have come together to start codifying some of these traditional practices, start to work together with communities to develop our own alternative models? I was just curious to know if in your professional circles, you've come across such initiatives, because I think those would really go a long way to saying, if we're criticizing these existing models, then we then offer alternative models, which we are then working together with the communities to promote. Yeah, thank you.
Great point, Violet, thank you. Mordecai, may I turn that to you to think about that? And as your, yeah, let me turn that to you and then I'll have a separate comment.
Yes. I don't know of any groupings. I know myself personally, and with a couple of colleagues, have helped give input in people developing how they're using their resources and all that. But philosophically, first of all, I think it's very important that we do that, and we should have it backed by our statutory systems, ministry, and educational systems, to make sort of, or state the obvious, that our existence is not an uncivilized one. We should, however, avoid that language of alternatives. Alternative feeds into the savior's narrative that they found a vacuum. The alternative to oppression is that the oppressor goes away. So we should never make the savior feel that we need him and we need to develop an alternative so that he can go away. We want him to go away. Whatever we do thereafter is our business. So let's avoid the alternative things. We are not looking for alternatives. We are looking to strengthen what was already there long before even we existed. So I think philosophically, it's very important to have that mindset. Let's go back and find what has always been there. We are not looking for alternatives, because what is there now is not good, and it's invasive, and it's foreign, and it's parasitic.
May I chip in?
Yes, please.
I have extensively covered the controversies surrounding the Northern Nigerian Trust in Isiolo. And I know of a group called WASO professionals who have joined hands with Borana Council of Elders. So you're talking of professionals who have come on board because they felt that that is their land, is being lost through this model supported and promoted by NRT. And I think one of the hallmarks of what they are trying to do is the recognition of the Delta Council of Elders as the custodians and the people who give guidance on how the rangeland should be used. And I know one of the things that has happened, and it never, is that they kind of came up with a draft legislation based on the traditional data rules. This legislation was supposed to pass in the Isiolo County Assembly, but it was frustrated because of the influence that NRT has in the county assembly. And I know one of the people who is a patron of the professional group and who comes in between the Council of Elders and the professionals, is now actually looking for a position of an MCA to go out there and actually now campaign from the inside. I also know our group, it's called Oromo Cultural Group. During the time that the government started the task force on forest destruction, we actually went there and presented our, I know Ogada doesn't want to use that, but we present our alternative perspective on how this should be done, which is based on our culture as a community.
Original perspective.
So we did this. We also went to Karura Forest and requested the Kenya Forest Service to give us a shrine. And because we have youth among us, we actually try. I'm not that old, but I know there are people in our group who are quite elderly, people who are over 80 years of age. So we are trying this. Maybe it's minimal, but I also think that Violet, in her own little way, she's trying to do a similar thing in Fagoto Forest, where she's actually organizing the local youth and actually bringing in people from other parts of Nairobi and other parts of the country to appreciate this forest as our own resource, because these are our resources, and we must emphasize that. These resources, and I'm going to use this, I'm not being racist, these resources do not belong to white people. They belong to us, and we must save them back. But we are not going to save them back and use the model that they brought on board. We are going to use our own model. We are going to intermarry with whatever we think is good about their model. But I think at the end of it all, we are going to get back these resources, and we are going to manage them for our own good, not because somebody wants to have this very nice spectacle because he or she is a tourist. Tourism, as Ogada has always mentioned, is an incidental benefit. It is not supposed to, we are not supposed to conserve because somebody wants to appreciate it. We conserve because we need the water, we need all these environmental resources. This is good for us. The spectacle is superb, even for our own eyes. So we can do this for ourselves. But then, at the end of it, if we get something which is an incidental benefit, there's nothing wrong with that. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, those are some excellent observations in terms of both the need to connect on the institutional level and making sure that legally our laws and our policies reflect some of these needs and fill the gaps. Also, of course, with our elected leaders, and making sure that we're involving the youth. I want to read out a comment here from Gena Mweya in the Q&A, and she says, we're moving in the right direction. More and more of us young people in Kenya are beginning to see what is really happening to our nature and wildlife, and doing the best to change the perceptions of people around us confronting apartheid in conservation. So I think she's echoing what she's saying, and applause, of course, there from Mordecai. And this, of course, ties into one of the things we were saying earlier, is being able to change the narrative, right? Telling our own story. And one of the things that struck me, which is why I think it's amazing that this book didn't come out yesterday. You published it several years ago, and yes, it's still so appropriate. And some of you may have seen that in April this year, Netflix released President Barack Obama's series on our great national parks, and our is, very broadly defined, and that includes Tsavo. Tsavo was featured a whole 1-hour episode on the Tsavo, and what struck me as I was watching that, and this comes again to telling our narrative, so bear with me here. As I was watching that episode, the only human being who appeared in the entire hour was President Obama at the beginning. There was not a single African who was featured, not a single house or a hut. We did see the SGR train coming through, so we knew that there was humanity that cut through the Tsavo, but otherwise it was pretty pristine and fantastic shots, as you know, and what an amazing job National Geographic does, in terms of taking, pulling together these documentaries. Very pristine, not a single African shown, even though he talked about some of the rangers who were involved in managing that park. So for comparison, I watched the next episode, which was about the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary in California. And the tagline for it was, California's vibrant coastline gets its close-up with an emphasis on the delicate balance struck between wildlife and humanity. And right in the beginning, 1 minute and 3 seconds into that episode, there were humans shown, you know, in the sanctuary, using the sanctuary. We also saw housing at 2 minutes plus, housing built along the water, people using the sanctuary, surfing, etc. So we've got this juxtaposition, right, of which continues even 100+ years later, of these protected spaces that we're talking about, where there's no African involved, right, versus a recognition that other people are able to manage their very precious national reserves, parks, and resources in a way that balances the needs of humanity and the protection of those wild spaces. So, you know, I come back to the statement that you made earlier in your book in terms of, and it was what you called the biggest, I really want to pull it up because I thought it was very dramatic the way you put it, in terms of the exclusion, that the biggest, the lie here is the absence of Africans in terms of managing our resources and our lack of knowledge, and the fact that the only way to protect, and I use the term advisedly, to protect, the only way to protect and conserve our resources is by keeping the people out, the Watus out of the scene, right? And so thinking about that, you know, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, when we're thinking about that lie, because we're close to time, I wanted to turn it over to both of you, starting with you, Mbaria, and finishing with you, Mordecai. As we're going out, I really wanted to, we've talked about some of the new models, some of and as Mordecai says, going back to the original story, our original practices. For some of the folks who are watching who are interested in learning more, youth who are looking to participate and engage in these topics, what is your advice as we're winding up now? We're moving from the big conservation lie to what? And let's start with you, Mbaria, and then Mordecai.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a good question. The basic thing that everybody, and particularly people in the so-called conservation cults in the West, need to do, they need to unlearn. And they need to start appreciating that between our ears, there's something. We are not just empty vessels. We are not here to just appreciate what they brought here. Yes, they used to say that if you want to hide something from an African, put it in books. No, we are here, and we are actually giving them notice that whatever we have started, and we are not the ones who have started, there are other people before us. This is something that's going to go on and on and on and on. And the one thing that they need to do is to unlearn. Whether they go to school to unlearn, or whether they unlearn in their own societies, or they unlearn from our own efforts of doing things that are good for us, for ourselves. We don't care how they do it, but we are going to do it ourselves. We are going to manage, we are going to conserve these resources simply because they are good for us. The other thing you also need to do is that, I mean, it's so arrogant that these people came here and displaced everything, including our thought patterns and our philosophy, our ethics, conservation, and all that. It's so arrogant of them. And I think this arrogance needs to be toned down, because what has this landed the world today? Loss of species. We have lost resilience in communities against climate change today. Everything has gone, almost everything has gone haywire. Don't they think it's a time that they stop and say, wait a minute, maybe you are guiding the world in the wrong direction. And probably these people who we look down upon, these people with woolly hair and big lips and all that, probably these people have the answers, together with other indigenous communities in South America and all these other places. People, they have the answers, because how did they survive for all those hundreds of years? And why is it that after a mere slightly over 100 years, everything seems to be collapsing. So I think that requires a measure of lessening the arrogance and knowing that even Africans, there are people like us. Africans have fought, Africans constructed the pyramids. They knew, because we colonized them and because we enslaved them, doesn't mean that they do not have brains to run their own show. So we are not, I cannot put it in a more politically acceptable manner. Or I'm saying that they have to lessen arrogance and they have to unlearn and they have to stop the racism. This way, we do not require them to do it. We do not beg them to do it because we have to do it. We have to manage, you have to conserve our resources in a manner that benefits us, in a manner that will sustain, in a manner that is going to improve the resilience, because we are facing huge catastrophe if you don't do this because of climate change. So when you are in that corner, do you stand and start now being start knowing how you are going to be politically correct? No. You do what a man or a woman, a society, or a race must do. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Barry. I really appreciate it. Mordecai?
Yes, and I'm so glad you referenced the Netflix series. And I'd like to tell the young people that series shows that the noise we are making, we are shaking the walls. One of the biggest complaints I and others spoke about is the constant whiteness of David Attenborough covering natural spaces in Africa and the absence of Black people. So they reached for the nearest, most influential Black person they could find, which was Barack Obama. But over a century after Roosevelt, we don't want another US president telling us what's important about our heritage. We don't care what he thinks. Tsavo is ours, it's important to us. And the whole world is welcome to come and appreciate Tsavo, but they should not refer to it as commonly owned between us and them. It's ours. I do not have any share in Yellowstone, so I cannot refer to Yellowstone as ours or Yosemite. So Tsavo belongs to us Kenyans. The world is welcome to come and appreciate it. But let's own our heritage. Let's be wary of people who come from far away and tell this thing and create some sort of corporate feeling between us and themselves, because that is not truth, and that is not the truth. And this also touches on global instruments like UNESCO's World Heritage Center thing. How is Mount Kenya Forest World Heritage Center? It belongs to Kenya. It belongs to Kenya, and there are people in there using it. World heritage sites are things like the pyramids that don't have living people in them and are monuments. Living systems with people in them you cannot claim corporate ownership like that. So I think it's important for us to understand the volume of our voices. And I love that comment that came from one of the people in the chat about realizing what's going on, because we've been lied to for a long time. And for those who are Africans living in Africa, remember that science, or what you're told is science, has as much dishonesty as everything else. Whether you talk of banking, business, there's conmen everywhere. There's conmen in science as well. Because the science that tells you human beings are a problem to conservation in Kenya today is the same science that tells you that Kenya is the cradle of mankind and hominids have been here for 1.2 million years. So we can't have become a problem now in 2022 because we've always been here. Depending on your belief system, we've been here a long time. So believe in yourself, believe in your knowledge, and read voraciously, not just to find out the truth, but to find out the lies as well. Then we'll be in a good place.
What an excellent place to end, with those two comments and really a double exclamation mark. I mean, we could go on for ages. I have lots of notes that I could have continued for at least another hour. And I'm glad to see that we have, most of our audience stayed with us and stuck through. If I missed seeing your hand, I really apologize for doing that, but I really want to thank both our authors for being here. We were promised that it would be a very interesting, very provoking, sometimes controversial conversation, and I think it proved to be that, as well as extremely informative and very appropriate at this time. So I want to thank them both. And I want to thank the audience as well. And at this moment, I will turn it over to Sandra at Columbia to take us out.
Thank you, Nyaguthie. I thank you all for being in attendance today. I thank you, Dr. Mbaria and Dr. Ogada, for carrying us through this session. I admire the zealous yet compassionate spirit you both have when it comes to speaking about things that the future generation needs to take hold of and preserve them with so much esteem, because we are slowly getting, I don't know if it's the right word, kind of brainwashed. But we need to turn back and say, wait a minute, we need to be able to claim back what is ours. So I hope that the people who are here today, especially the younger generation, have actually gotten a sense of what it feels like to protect what is essence, your birthright. So I also want to thank Nyaguthie for moderating this session. I have admired your composure, your sense of just interjecting where it seemed that was appropriate, and paying keen attention to our audience and ensuring the conversation has transcended beyond our expectations. We hope that to another time you'll have the opportunity to do this again. We are grateful for you. I thank our audience for sticking with us till the end. Please follow us on social media for the next coming book talks. We have quite an engaging session on the 22nd of June, titled The Sex Lives of African Women. It will be great to have all of you there and to just also continue discussing things that transcend boundaries. So thank you very much. Have a good evening, have a good morning, and may you all enjoy your day. We hope to see you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye.